My name's Libby Werble. I'm the director here at the Lumber Room, and I work alongside Sarah Miller-Miggs, who is the owner and founder of the space, to invite different artist engagements in and around the Miller-Miggs collection. And we've been at it in the space for over 12 years now in different capacities. Each exhibit looks very different, and so we are now inside of the Rose, which is our very first foray into a group show of this size. So thank you all for joining us, and maybe some of you were at our opening yesterday. This show came about because Justine Kurland is a very dear and cherished artist that we have in the collection, and we admire and we follow her work. And over the pandemic, Justine found herself without as much access to a darkroom, and photographic practice started becoming more and more challenging. So she started looking at her photograph books in her house, and then she started cutting up those photograph books in her house. And what came out of that experience, which she can speak more to if she chooses, is this really, really rich collage practice. And honestly, everything Justine does, we're down for, and we're here to support. But the conversation that kind of was the seed of this exhibit came from thinking about how we could support Justine in her research and better understanding of the world of collage, and really lift up this like very, very cherished like medium in the arts. And all of a sudden it grew from maybe we should throw together a few pieces from our collection to maybe we need to start thinking about all of these other artists in our community that are feeding us, and show those works alongside some seminal works of historically significant collage artists. So what you're seeing is this amazing, very intentional, very thought out collage of an exhibit. So on that note, we thought we would want to talk a little bit more, or invite Justine to talk a little bit more about the process and how we got there. And then also with her cherished friends, Kim Bourus and Keisha Scarville, expand on some of the bigger themes, but also some of these unique individual themes of all of these artists. There are 44 artists in the show, and so obviously we've talked a lot about not wanting to flatten any individual perspective or individual work, but how can we, by creating this exhibit, start all of these really dynamic conversations? And hopefully that's reflected, but I really want to invite them to speak more on that. And so without further ado, I'd like to welcome Kim Bourus of Higher Pictures in New York, gallery director and founder, and Keisha Scarville, artist in the exhibit. Her works are featured on the plinth behind you, and Justine Kurland, we're huge fans of. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, Libby. The first thing I want to say is that Libby and Sarah and I really feel like it's a co-curatorial credit that we should all share. We've had so many conversations over the last year and a half of putting this exhibition together. And I think one of the things that I've learned doing this, or that I continue to try to learn, is to try to decenter myself and to create space for all of these amazingly genius women around me, and to really try to find a way of collaboration where we amplify each other's voices. And I am so grateful that Kim Bourus is up here, who is my partner, and there is not a single thing that I've done in the last 9 years that has not been in collaboration with Kim, whose program at Higher Pictures has really taught me about how to support other artists, and how we are all making culture together, and how, as the makers of culture, we're in a unique position to change it. And Keisha Scarville is an artist who I've long admired, and I'm just like, have the biggest art crush on. So she has a book coming out with Mac that I think that you guys should all pre-order, and it's just gonna be a remarkable, remarkable book, and she's gonna talk about this extensive body of work that we are featuring 65 out of 250 individual works that comprise a single artwork that is just, it's a 10-year-long piece that she's been working on, so that's very exciting to hear from her. But I thought, because I've being in this room is, like, this is my favorite show that has ever happened in the world. So I have so much to say about it that I actually did just want to read this curatorial statement because I put so much thought into it, and maybe just getting those ideas out there would help us to talk. So I'm just gonna, this will just be a quick read, so bear with me. And I'm gonna maybe paraphrase through this, but so Libby has said it's 44 artists in the show, multi-generational, I'm creating a new genealogy of collage. This morning, I saw a post that David Campany, who's a curator, had posted with, that said that Duchamp was the Dada daddy of collage. So I was like, damn, didn't he see my show? So this is very actively presenting another narrative, a counter-narrative to that idea of the Dada daddies. So I imagine an extended family of artworks where kinship is forged through association, amplifying themes and providing context through similarity and difference. And I think the difference is really important. Sounding out feelings in language is a collective effort. The works convene like the petals of a rose, a collage in and of itself. The title is an homage to Jay DeFeo's seminal work by the same name. The painting took 8 years, DeFeo ladling paint to canvas 1 teaspoon at a time for the rose to swell to a weight of 2 tons, 12 feet high, 12 inches thick. In order for it to be removed from her studio building, the building had to be cut open as if given an episiotomy. Immediately after completing this monumental piece, DeFeo turned to photography and collage. The rose taught her about circularity in art making as an iterative practice where one thing turns into another, entering a cycle of self-reference and mutation that amassed rotational gravity from its orbit. The work on view touches the figure of the rose at oblique angles in reference to a vaginal form. And really, at first, all we were talking about was vaginas. But it's a muscular art full of nerve ending and teeth, a cipher of female desire, pleasure, and rage. As a circular form, it provides a relief from hierarchical power, offering the cyclical, organic, and revolutionary in its place. It's a portal, and the idea of the portal is, I think, really important to think about in terms of Keisha's work, in terms of the passport, in terms of Gina's work. I mean, so many, the Bontecou. Okay, where was I? Through which we birth ourselves, a cyborg, automaton, or Frankenstein's monster. And so many pieces of the show actually have this kind of like cyborg, and I think it's really interesting to think about identity and politics, but to think about how we're hobbling ourselves together, and how bruised we become moving through those portals. Okay, the rose is a bruise unfolding from sites of everyday crisis, from the repeated battering of systemic and structural abuse. The rose as a collage, open space to feel, to grieve, to commemorate. Perhaps it's one flower in a funeral bouquet, perhaps it's the rose, or perhaps it's the vase itself. And here I want to point to, this is one of the ways that Libby was like so thoughtful and so collaborative in this process, where there's a Portland's own Ursula Le Guin's story, The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction, where she writes about the carrier bag being the first technology of humans that before there were spears or swords or arrows, implements, weapons of destruction, there was the idea that we're gathering nuts and berries and that we are holding these things together, and that in fact, what the bag does is it opens up space, and the bag is an expressive medium in its own right. And so I think so many of the collages, and I definitely think about Keisha in this terms, is about that kind of the possibility of opening. Contradiction is inherent within the very form of collage. It pieces together a restorative language from the stuff that would do us harm. It counters violence with violence. It cuts, rips, rents apart, necessitating in turn the reparative action of gluing, binding, bringing things back together in new unity. Some of the artists work with scissors and glue, a classic method of collage dating to the earliest instances of the form, scrapbooks made by Victorian housewives. Other borrows a narrative approach from histories of quilting, encoded messages within stitched shapes. Photography frequently laminates disparate parts into a single plane, and three-dimensional assemblage expands the notion of collage. Some works included are not collages at all, but resonate thematically like distant cousins. The artists source their archival materials, family albums, and vernacular imagery, disrupting the production of knowledge and power. They use photography, paint, scraps of paper, fabric, video, ceramics, string, text as tools for survival and as technologies for world building, for radical deprogramming, and to untangle the insidious complicity in the devaluation of ourselves and others. Here, collage is the art of centering the margins, of folding into, of invagination and inversion, of turning things upside down to drain the clogged phlegm of the status quo, to allow us to patch ourselves into the world through the repeated instance that the sheer force of our attention and care is transformative. And here I want to also kind of talk about Sarah Meigs and the kind of care that she has exhibits through this collection, the generosity of having it open to all of us, the platform that she gives to artists, and the politics of how she collects, centering women and people of color, and the website for the Lumber Room, there is every single piece of the collection is available for you to look at online. She lends these to other institutions so that the work still circulates in the world, and it's just like the most caring, beautiful way of participating in the work, and it is so collaborative. And so when I was looking through her collection to think about this show, there were so many ways that the collection itself was, a kind of like foremother of like conceiving the show because of all of the carefulness of thinking that Sarah has done in her collection. Like I walked through the Lorena Grady show with Sarah, and she read every single plaque and every single, piece of paper. She just, it's like I have ADD or something. Like I'm just like, oh, but let's go over here. But the carefulness of that is just, it was really important. And so, yeah, so that's how it started. Do you? I actually want to hear from Kim first, because I feel like Kim was also like, I was bouncing all these ideas, and I want to end with Keisha because I'm just to go from the micro to the macro. But do you want to talk about what it was like being on the side of all of that?
Does this work?
Yeah.
Yes, it does. Okay. All right. Yeah, I think that coming to collage from photography specifically, and in talking about Justine's work in terms of that transition from a sheet of film to a sheet of an image or of a book, from a book. That was not a hard or difficult transition, and shouldn't have been, I don't think, in terms of expressing or having a political statement, showing, I guess, using collage as a means, for social change, personal change. And when we discussed SCUM, which was Society for Cutting Up Men's Books, specifically her library, it seemed very natural, something natural to do. And it was something to kind of use as a springboard to enter a larger conversation, not to obliterate it. I don't know if that helps. But there's quite a lot to think about in terms of the very short history, the 200-year history of photography. It's very young. It's not a long time. There's a lot of potential and a lot of room. If there's anything in the medium that we, look forward to, it's this expanse. It's pretty infinite. It's up to us. We can go to the first photograph ever made. Start from there. And that's a really rare place to kind of think about. You can't do that with painting. You can't do that with any other medium. And so you can qualify and quantify. Yeah. So collage, why not?
Yeah.
Why not start with the books? Why not start with that page?
Part of that history of looking back at, that we can look back at, is also its kind of problematic, troubling legacy of colonialism and empiricism and like all of the harm that photography has done, right? So
that's a good thing, because then it's not about, saying something and not being able to kind of back that up, have a case, build that case very clearly. You can really track. I think that's important for everybody to be able to ingest and articulate and move forward with that.
I think so much of the work in the show here, so out of the 44 artists, I think, it's part of what I was thinking about, and what's hard to do with me being in the center stage here is like how I decenter my own whiteness and my own privilege and my own complicity in all of this, and how to move forward in a positive, like in a world that we want to live in, how to make a world we want to live in, and how to kind of think about bridging and interconnection, but without saying like, oh, well, we're all ladies, so it's all the same, or we're all like, we're all people, so it's all the same, without flattening what the difference is, the really different experiences, and the necessity for different voices to be centered. So one of the things, just thinking about the show, is my dear friend Jessica Jackson Hutchins, who is like an amazing artist who I've been friends with 30 years, and I knew right away that she had to be in the show. And so she has this gorgeous glass piece. She's been working on glass for 12 years, and her work is very political and very. So when we were installing the show, we were thinking about where to place that, and it glows with light. So at first we were like, we're going to put it right here because, that's for the art, that would be like nice to have all of that light. But it was really important not to center and bring all of the attention away from what is behind us. This, in essence, a family album, and hung together like a family album of Lorna Simpson, A.K. Jenkins, who I see back there, and Kiana Mestrich, who was with us yesterday, who flew all the way from New York to be with us, and this conversation of how their works are creating these avatars of these Black women together in solidarity, and letting that, giving space to that conversation, you know. So that was so important to like kind of thinking about how to be together in the room without it, you know.
Yeah, and really important to have a room.
Yes.
You know, so you have these ideas, but often there isn't a room.
Yeah. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah and Libby.
And Libby.
Yeah.
And Pilar.
And you, I think like
And
there's a,
Keaton.
yeah. And maybe Keisha.
And Keisha.
You could
Well,
talk about
yeah.
rooms and spaces.
Yeah, maybe
and
this is a good time to hear from Keisha about her work. Do you want a better?
No, that's fine. That's fine. Hello, everyone. I think one of the first things, well, first I do want to say, you know, it's just been amazing. This is my first time in Portland, and it's been amazing that this is the reason why I'm here. I think the show that you've put together, you know, I feel so incredibly honored to be in this space and meeting all of the amazing artists and amazing women that I've met, and individuals that I've met over this time, and hearing and talking, and, you know, it's put a battery in my back, you know, in terms of really thinking about what's next, and where can the conversation go from here. So that's something I just wanted to say that first off, and I just love walking around this space. So, you know, one of the things that I've been thinking about, so with my work, I am focusing on my father's first passport photo. And being first generation, my father came here in 1967. And one of the things that I was thinking about in this conversation and thinking about my process and working with my dad's passport photo is the ways in which I'm thinking about the insidiousness of neutrality, right? And I'm thinking about the function of the passport photo as a flattener. For me, my first impulse automatically became collage, even though over time it started to develop into different modes of reiteration. I think for me, collage became this space in which I could kind of push against the functionality of the passport photo. And I'm always thinking about what is the function of it? What is the function of photography? What is the function of an image? But specifically for the passport photo, there was something to that became this space where there could be autonomy, but also this way of introducing disorder and refusal, that collage just became that natural impulse. So just wanting to kind of think about, because I'm thinking about some of the things that you're saying in terms of how the images, you know, what is something that we can claim within that. And so that became just to respond, that became my foray into using collage as a medium to work with that. Okay.
No, I don't want to talk all the time. I don't want to be the only time. I know that was, there's, just for you who are here who don't know, every day Keisha wakes up and works with these passport pictures, and I love the way that you just spoke about it, about disrupting or the refusal of that functionality of the passport. I remember reading somewhere you talking about territorial subjecthood. Can you talk more about that? Because that was so beautiful also about, just, yeah.
I just realized I didn't give background. Yeah, I should start there. The project started actually in 2012. At the time I was conducting these like interviews and conversations and recording them of my parents, and basically wanting to just have conversations around their experience. It was coming up on 50 years for both of them, having been here in America. And it was just, my dad and I sitting down talking, and he had retired at the time, and I asked him, my family's from Guyana, South America, and I asked him, I was like, okay, well, you're retired, like, you're going back to Guyana, like, what's the next thing? And he, very clearly and very matter-of-factly said, I don't identify as Guyanese anymore, I'm an American, that's how I identify. And it just, for me, it struck me, because it started this whole thing where I was just like, okay, well, what does it mean to claim the identity of American? And also having been from elsewhere, how does one claim this as the space? And for me, I started to ask him questions and dig deeper into the impulse of coming here. And coming here, in 1967. And you were speaking about the carrier bag, and I'm thinking about, what are the things that we carry with us? But also what are we, what is the landscape, the social landscape that we become embedded in? I lost my train of thought. What were you asking me? I'm trying to remember. I'm trying to keep on track.
You were talking about him being an American, and
No,
yeah,
I know that.
Yeah. And the carrier bag. And
I got that.
The stuff that we carry.
Maybe
with
the
us.
daily ritual.
The daily ritual.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone.
Sorry.
For me, the platform. I just wanted to make sure I was staying in the conversation. Yeah. So for me, it became really interesting. That all of the ways in which we are told to present ourselves to the camera for our passport image to be taken, but also the fact that the passport image is taken in hopes of the body moving in the future, and moving across borders, So for me, it became an ongoing conversation that still is happening today of all of those things, and there's this aspect of care, but there's also this aspect of the passing through the portal and the way in which shape-shifting comes into play to become a citizen. And what are those promises? And I think you even spoke about this, what are those things that one is aspiring towards? Is it really guaranteed? There are all these things in terms of the passports are informed by conversations and stories that my dad shared with me, in his journey to coming to this place where he identifies as American. So it's this thing where it's like I wake up every day and I sit with them and I sit with the images. I initially I think I was like, oh, I'll just make maybe 10. or 20, and now it just doesn't stop. But I think that the conversation just doesn't end. I think part of the reason why it's been ongoing is because there is no finality, I think, in what I am trying to understand. And I don't know if there's a finality for my dad either. And now I'm sitting here, I'm like, that's a question I might want to ask him. Yeah.
When you were just talking now, too, about the way that the body travels through space, it was reminding me of the work that is in this Mac book that was Kim showed, that was called Limb. Do you want to talk about that work that you showed?
Well, I think it's so much more interesting when an artist talks about their work. And I'm sorry to disappoint everybody, but it's, I think that, again, I think that the function of the gallerist in one of the functions was to not just talk about these things, but allow for this space for it to happen. And I think from there, like this show, it'll move. It'll move in a direction that it needs to move in. I trust that. I trust that artist. I trust the work. Someone encountering your work might not know who you are. I hope for that. They'll know your work, and then they'll have the pleasure of, on their own, or through a friend, learning about you and your message. So Lim was, and so much of the exhibitions that we have was a result of it understanding very deeply that these moments and spaces were far too few, if not non-existent. So, I'm only coming to this conversation in 2007 at the age of 32, saying I've got an apartment space, let's, very intentionally, I'm gonna make this a space for everybody to come 5 days a week to see, works by the likes of someone like Keisha or Gina Osterloh or A.K. Jenkins back there, or, anyone I could find, Yamini, that I could help support within the thread, though, of, again, what had happened, again, from the beginning. That was really important. So yes, it's been 200 years, but again, not a lot of time. We can have 200 years. That's what I would like, despite the realization of who we are and how limited we are as human beings. So, yeah. So Lim, happy to have Lim. It's in the conversation. It's on the table. People are seeing it. People are writing about it. People are owning the work. Yeah. And Keisha. Really important conversation to be included in. Yeah.
I mean, maybe it's a wormhole to go in and start talking about work that's not here, but I really want you guys to all look at Lim, because I understood the connection between the passports and this body of work, Lim, where often Keisha is distorting her body so that she can move through spaces in ways that both echo immigration, echo the way Black bodies in the United States have to navigate through white supremacy, that echo the dance of the limbo that was developed in Middle Passage on slave ships. But somehow, the way you were talking about the positioning of the bodies and thinking about the way that your father is also dancing the limbo somehow in this, and it was really nice to hear you just talking about space, because it brings me back to the process in which Sarah, Libby, and myself we're thinking about how to create the space for all of the voices in this room, and that the design of these walls that were built, especially by Spencer, who I can't remember his last name, but is like a design installation genius, really creates a limbo line through the show, you know, and kind of opens up this space through which we go into this part of the show. The show is very, you know, there's kind of like, it starts like an onion or a rose. It's supposed to be a rose, but it starts with the room of holes where we, you know, Yamini Nair, whose beautiful work is on the right wall here, is like, it's the portal, right? And it's speaking to Gina Osterloh's work that is kind of bringing us even outside of the room. And so that is, I wanted to pass the mic to Gina, and there was this really kind of beautiful way that she was also talking about the portal that I think speaks to what you're talking about with the passport. So Gina also has all of our edges, which is a series of silhouettes in blue that's also related to that piece is called Push and Erase, right? Press and erase. But yeah, can we hear from you, Gina?
Yeah, well, I mean, one linker there, and then I'd love to share. But thinking about, you know, Keisha, your work and how you said the insidiousness of neutrality, right? And that that compression into a space of neutrality is an incredible compression, right? Psychically, ethically, historically, culturally. And how, as an artist, does your hand traverse that space of neutrality? Was just incredibly, it's just generative, moving, right, to witness, and how you also shift a photo that is endlessly reproducible to something that is incredibly unique in each and every moment that you touch. The surface. Yeah, it's just such a treat to sit with your work in person, right? In the space, right? There's always the book or the online JPEG, right? But to see your work in person is such a shift for me, and I'm very grateful. Justine, you were asking about the red photograph on the wall, Press and Erase. A lot of my work starts with a question, and when I was creating that room, that curved red room made of paper, I was asking, what does it look like if the body is mimicking the void, the whole? And it was an incredible shift for me when I made that work, because for the first time as an artist, I was thinking about multiple viewing spaces simultaneously. I was thinking about our viewing space here in a gallery or a museum from far away. What does it look like to walk closer and eventually to be 2 inches away from the photograph, revealing my brown skin, shades of my hair, pressing into what is seemingly a black hole on the wall. But it's just paper. It's just a paper piece of black paper. I'm in a leotard, and really thinking about this liminal space that I can create, where the paper is a stand-in also for a second body, a type of epidermal second skin, if you will. A lot of things happened for me in that photograph. That was 2007. I was still in graduate school. I started to pay attention to the shape of the seams as a type of cut or fissure in the room.
Can you talk about the vanishing vagina?
I can talk about the vanishing vagina, yes. So we think about, absolutely photography being only 200 years old, but it was also constructed by drawing devices that came much before photography, drawing devices that would translate three-dimensional volume into flatness, right? And which was based on single point perspective, which was based on a single point, right? And so the German word for perspectival point is Fluchtpunkt, which also means fleeing point. And this is coming from a writer who has been incredibly influential for me. Her name is Sarita Echevez, who wrote the book, The Decolonized Eye, Filipino-American Art and Performance. And when I read this notion of Fluchtpunkt, and she's referring to an etching by Albert Dürer where he has collaged ideal versions of the female body into a reclining woman that is laying across on a table, and where the draftsman is peering across a phallus or to gain perspective and to translate her body onto the page, right? And this notion, though, of the Fluchtpunkt being a point which is pointing towards her vagina, but the viewer cannot see the vagina because her hand is blocking the vagina, became this moment where I was like, oh, well, yes, it's single point perspective, and the end point of Western perspectival system could be this point of desire and ownership, but the Fluchtpunkt actually, the vanishing vagina, has agency, because it's in motion. It's not fixed. And that was a big shift for me, to see the whole as this point of potential.
I mean, as you're speaking, thank you, Gina. I was thinking about one of the, and apologies for those who don't have photographic experience, but I remember when I was first learning photography in the darkroom, and one of like the essential parts of the process is the fixer, you know, and you're taught that, okay, well, if you don't fix it, then you can't bring it out into the sun. It's all gonna be hell. You know, like everything's gonna disappear or vanish, and the image is no longer going to be stable, you know. And so I'm thinking about that in relationship to this show and some of the things that you're speaking about, because there's something about the fixed image and pushing against that and releasing, you know, or just there's something about this kind of pushing against fixity. Is that a word? You know, and I'm thinking about that in relationship to your work, but I'm thinking about that in relationship to the whole show, and the ways in which the body is kind of pushing against these like fixed representations, and what can be released or what can be unearthed and what can break through that, and what new language, you know what I mean, like in terms of like the assemblage, like what new language can we create that goes against that. And so that's something I don't know if you want to speak more to that, but that's something that I'm thinking about, and as you were speaking, that was just kind of percolating into my head. Yeah.
Well, do you want
Maybe AK.
But we could talk about AK's work, about that
Yeah, I mean,
idea.
it's
What
right
don't
I
about
talk?
AK's work?
No, I mean, I think that like the way she's, you know, through photography has created this visibility to then only erase again. And I think that's kind of been the...
Wait, before, I love what you're saying, but before, just because I'm not sure everyone knows what we're talking about. So in this, I said that this group is comprised of 3 different artists. So the work that is addressing Black women's labor in the office place is Kiana Mestrich. So those are the ones with the early IBM cards and these collages in black on black. The Lorna Simpson are the ones with the jewels, but the AK work on the wall all have these silver frames, and each one is a Black lesbian poet from a book that was published in the 70s, where AK is pulling the actual page of the book out and cutting into this, you know, what once was a silver gelatin print, and using spray paint to create an emanation, right? So using this kind of like low street material to create the soul of these lost lesbian poets. But yeah, go on with what you're saying, just so that people know what you're talking
I think
about.
it's good. I mean, like you pulling pages to create space, she's pulling spaces to make space, right? So,
No, but I don't want you to lose your track, because you said something really kind of amazing about, like, to the point of bringing the book, and the point of AK also showing this work again is to give visibility, and then at the same time opening up the space that takes away.
To take it and own it as well. So, and I think our relationship with photography of all mediums can be applied very specifically to collage, right? It doesn't need to necessarily be cut up. If, like Tara's work here, it's not something that has a multitude of like physical presence, but one flat like surface, right? That ability of the medium, I think, is again pretty. We have an infinite amount of like possibilities within this like relatively technological kind of whatever you want to call it advancement in the medias that artists actually have to communicate specifically with. And then forget about, like, you have black and white, and then you go to color, and then it's like even more, expansive. So, and that's just the physical support of this. But yes, and did it just go up? How did that happen? Sorry. Sorry about that. Yeah. So. Okay. Sorry. It looks bigger in my hand for some reason. Yeah, so with AK's work, I mean, I don't think it's, I think there's a history to what they're trying to communicate, but I think it's incredibly effective in relationship to even your work with like talking about ectoplasm and other worlds, or other, using the erasure to communicate, maybe more so than the representation.
So Keisha has a body of work called Mama's Clothes, where you're referencing in certain of the photographs spirit photography, where in the turn of the century there were these photographs made where spirits were considered to be this ectoplasm, and so these they were maybe faked photographs, but I think there is also something very real about those photographs, and so Keisha uses in one amazing photograph this like silvery dress of her mother's that's coming out of your mouth, and it really does have this really interesting idea of a kind of ectoplasm that happens in AK's work. And just to reference what Kim was saying about Tara Kraynek, is these 3 pictures on the side here that's part of a series called Contact Sheet 1979. So Tara is an artist who was born in Lima, Peru, and was adopted by an American family, and goes back in her 30s and finds an archive of photographs that were made at her birthplace the year she was born. And the photographs are from an archive from a political magazine that are from specific stories about violence to women, because her origin is actually the result of an indigenous woman being raped, and projects these photographs that speak to the conditions of her birth, and places herself, collages herself back in time into these photographs. So collage can be the ripping apart, but it can also be this type of time travel, which I think time is this other element that is in a lot of the work in the show, but specifically Keisha's way of moving through these kind of the past of her father, 16-year-old self, to this idea of a speculative future of a world that could exist, or, to quote Tina Campt, will have had to have existed.
Well, I mean, I think, and I think I spoke, but I'm, like, in terms of archive, the ways in which aspects of archive don't necessarily reveal itself until much later, until years, if not decades into the future. And that conversation, that kind of temporal conversation, but I think with my father's image, you know, I spoke about like the function of the passport being taken for future travel, but how it also operates as an archival image for me. And I think there is, in some of the images, there is kind of a reimagining of where his body or where his identity could be if it were not, you know, in America. And in some cases, thinking about history and history being a jumping off point to discuss different futures. So in some of the pieces, you know, I reimagine him as a sea god, you know what I mean? Like, and so there's things, there are things in terms of this kind of back and forth play, but also this kind of future play that comes up for me in the pieces.
I think he's like 16 also in that photograph, and you're not there.
No. The time before you existed. Why don't we open up questions from the audience? Oh, yes. Actually, there was one other. I wanted to call on Bean Gilsdorf. Am I pronouncing it? Or is it Gilsdorf? Gilsdorf. Anyway, Bean, who has these amazing collages on the facing, on this wall. And for me, this was also a really kind of strong, powerful moment of the show of, you know, talking about how there's so many, first of all, I just want to say there's so many sightlines in the shows, and even as we were thinking through the curation and the hanging of the show to create ways where those conversations would amplify each other, there were so many other moments that were even surprises to us. But when we were hanging Bean's work, which are these collages of first ladies, you know, Nancy Reagan, thinking about white complicity and, you know, my own complicity, my own privilege, thinking about where to put that work was really, really difficult. And the work is so important to the show, is so much what this show is about. So finally, after like much thought, much deliberation, the way of activating the work, it became clear, was not to kind of weave it together with other people's work, but actually to let a charge pass in between to what these white women and this power, this kind of status quo has represented, and have the Pamela Sneed, the Roberta Roberts, the Natalie Ball, the Frida Orapabo on the other side as a standoff. And so I just wanted to hear from Bean too, because Bean is an amazing artist, and I think that it's a really important piece of the show.
Is this on? Okay, great, thanks. Thanks, Justine. I guess I would start by saying, like Keisha, I think a lot about the function of the image, and the way to describe my practice as succinctly as possible is to say that I steal images from mass market history books, particularly American history, print them onto fabric, and then cut and sew them. And the collages are basically coming out of a series that I did in 2018 where I was working specifically, I was creating a show that was specifically about the First Ladies, and I was thinking a lot about the kind of contingent power that First Ladies have. You know, they have a lot of influence, but it's all dependent on their husband's position. And that show was a series of sculptures that was looking at a space of like femininity, particularly as this kind of like space where there is power and isn't power, depending on where you have your alliances, right? And from there, you know, one of the things that's really interesting about looking at these, speaking of archive, looking at these books over and over again, is of course if you're looking at books that are images from, let's say, the 50s or 60s through the 90s or early 2000s, you're also looking at images of whiteness, because that's what's in those books, that's what's reified in those images. And so when you talk about the function of the image, you have to look at the way that the images are meant to be enacting upon you and the way that they're supposed to be telling a very specific story. And so when I was sort of moving through into the next phases and bodies of work, I started to cut up the, whereas before I had been talking somewhat about like the biography of these very particular women, I started to put their faces together. And in a lot of these images, of course, they're smiling, they're being offered up for public consumption. But within that space, there's also a kind of power shift, I think, too, where white women particularly are able to occupy, because of their supposed fragility, they're able to occupy a position that conversely has a lot of power behind it, and that power can turn monstrous very quickly. And so when I was putting these collages together, the faces are often quite frightening, right? They're meant to be sort of like nightmare images. And it's because I wanted to talk about the ways in which those images, when you look at them from an archival perspective over and over and over again, the way that the function acts upon your psyche. But I think too, just speaking more broadly, like the way for me, and I think some other folks who are in the show, to make sense of the world is to take it apart and try and put it back together in a way that we can live with it or live within it as much as possible. So.
Do you have any questions about the show that you want to ask before? Any questions? Okay, I'm like,
Wait.
I realize that maybe I just want the artists to ask questions, and if not, have a Q&A with the public. But if there's any artists that are here that are interested in hearing something else about the show and want to ask Justine to elaborate, this would be a great time. Not to put you on the spot. Yamini, do you have any questions? Hold on.
Or do you want to talk about your work? Maybe
Yeah,
you could,
we'd love to hear
preface
from
it
you, too.
about your work, and then you could. Yeah. Talk about cutting up and putting together.
Okay.
And creating
So-
spaces.
So my practice is really, I build sort of sculptural constructions and create flattened photographs from three-dimensional installations. I began, I never really thought about it as collage necessarily until recently. I always thought of my work as kind of in between or outside all of the sort of genres in a sense, and it couldn't really be categorized. And just recently, I'm kind of thinking about it in the realm of collage, like, oh, it feels so sort of interesting to be included in this sort of way, because the idea of cutting and kind of building through the cut has really been at the core of my practice for a long time. And I think of it, I guess thematically, there's a sense of a sort of rupture and repair that is, kind of cutting images from books, but also really working with simple materials like cardboard. And over time, the work has become much, much more sculptural in a sense. But it is very much this sort of maybe collage in 3D in a way. And then the camera, I work with a large format camera, and it does become this sort of portal where the work really becomes alive for me in looking through the camera. And Justine and I had some really interesting conversation in the studio around this, because the constructions themselves are, they're sort of very alive. There's so much there. And then the camera comes in and kind of clamps it down in a way, but there's a sort of, but it's not a clamping down. It's really sort of, there's a tension between the two, I think, that I'm really interested in. And I can't say that I've found that point yet. I think it's a longer journey, it's sort of this over time, but there is this sort of tension that I think speaks to photography too, because, that element of extraction that photography kind of negotiates with the world, right, is a kind of cutting in a sense, right? You're cutting from the world. And there is this tension that happens in the studio between what is very alive and then this sort of the memory of what is being built, and even death on some level, this sort of inherent kind of tension between that kind of life and death. So, which I think is sort of one of the inner conflicts of photography, So yeah, I mean, I guess that's what I have to say about that. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
And so I guess a question for Justine is, I know that the show really came, through a series of many conversations, and you sort of built almost like stringing together. So it would be so interesting to hear how that unfolded for you through time.
Thank you. Yeah, Nair. I was thinking also that kind of the other thing that maybe happens within the photograph too is this sense of ongoing mystery that that when you see the materials and you see the fragility of the materials, they feel so much more like you can enter them more in the photograph. It's a very strange thing, even though it's two-dimensional. But no, yeah, it's okay, my question. So because I had been working on collage for 3 or 4 years before I started this show, I came to Sarah with very specific, concrete ideas of what I was interested in with collage. And a lot of what I was interested in was this idea of circularity and this kind of, was it possible to replace a kind of a phallic structure with a female form, and how could we use circularity, and how could you think about people like, this kind of second wave feminist like Judy Chicago and, she wouldn't say her work was, but, George O'Keeffe, or and I was thinking a lot about flowers, because I had been cutting a lot of these flowers out of these men's books, because there was this idea at the time when Stieglitz told O'Keeffe that, made this kind of narrative, this mythology, that those paintings of flowers, that they were actually vaginas. O'Keeffe was never okay with that. She said, no, they're flowers. These are flowers. They're not vaginas. But he was trying to get her out of this ghetto where women paint flowers and men paint women, right? So, so there was something really interesting about thinking about cutting when I was cutting these men's books and turning them back into women who paint flowers, and to kind of complete that circularity. So I came to Sarah with I wanted to be about vaginas and flowers, and I was talking to AK, and AK is she's like, I don't see any vaginas. Maybe I'm too much of a lesbian, but these are not vaginas. In other words, I came with this kind of projection of what I wanted the show to be, and it grew incrementally through all these conversations, through looking at Sarah's amazing collection, drawing on the artists that I admire, that are part of my community, and creating associations. And that's also why the way that the show has been designed in this kind of spiral labyrinth, that it's not some kind of linear or predetermined idea of what the themes of the shows are, but I keep finding them. Beyond what I imagined they would be. I keep finding new ones. So it's like I knew I wanted Keisha's work, but I had no idea that Keisha and Hannah Wilke had so much relationship, except there they are. And it's incredible to see those two pieces together and the way they talk to each other. Or Yamini, the way that your work is with the Bontecou is I knew I wanted your work and I knew I wanted the Bontecou, but that's and then when we put Gina's work there, where there's just this it's kind of this bouncing, and I think that there's these sight lines that kind of create these, the vanishing vaginas, but it's, but the idea, what you're actually saying about this kind of moving point, so that the idea that the show continues to kind of open up and move and creates these other kind of ways of space, which isn't actually answering, because one of the things me and Kim were talking about is one of the questions is like, who wasn't included, right? That's like, people want to know who wasn't, and why weren't the people who should have been included not included? And that's like a really...
That's for the next 200 years to come.
Thinking about the vanishing vagina, and with Keisha, you were talking about the inherent kind of fixity of photography, how photography crops, cuts, Yamini, how you said it, photography automatically cuts and crops from the world, right? And Keisha, how you were talking about how photography fixes or creates this immobility, right? But through your work, and I absolutely see a connection, but with all the other works in the show, but everyone, all the artists performing this type of pressing against the fixity in their own unique way, right? And through some type of collage technique is incredibly powerful to witness it in person.
So we're just about out of time. There are a couple more artists, Olivia and Janice in the audience. Do you guys have anything else you want to ask or offer to this conversation, since we're lucky enough to have you here as well?
Come on, Janice. Bring it home.
Thinking of what Yamini was saying about initially not imagining her work as collage, of course, it's the same with me. And then I had to start thinking about... Which work is yours for the people who don't know? Oh, sorry. They're the little black and white photographs, right? Along the back somewhere. Where I've photographed myself in the mirror and I'm making small hand gestures in front of the camera's lens. So you see myself in the mirror, you see the hands in front of the camera, you see me behind the camera, and there is the collage. These different layers of different spaces. And also a lot of things about photography itself, reflections on photography, or rather the photograph is also about the function of the camera. We have the hands form this circle that could be larger or smaller, like the aperture of a camera, that can contract and dilate. The camera has a mirror, and so the photographs are photographed through a mirror. So there's these different layers or different aspects that do create a kind of collage. And then, as Justine has pointed out, there's the hole, the vagina, that also contracts and dilates. So these are just a few thoughts that went into making those photographs too. There's Olivia.
Hi. Hi. I love this conversation about fixing and pushing against being fixed. I was thinking about being in the dark room and the process of being exposed, being developed, being stopped, and then what it is to be fixed. And I think a lot of the work in this show, I don't know, it's just an interesting question that I've been thinking about, and that's what I have to share, that's all.
Olivia's piece is in the staircase. It's her hair is like Medusa, and it was part of a collage. Olivia is the one person in this whole show who made a new piece for the show. So we were talking about this work that she had made, and we were talking about this idea of expanding on these notions of collages. So she had this Medusa hairpiece and started. Well, actually, okay, I'm gonna be transparent. I wasn't gonna say it, but like, okay, so I was like, okay, a lot of Olivia's collages have penises in them, and I wanted to really get rid of the penises in the room. So I was like, what? I really love this collage, and I really love like the kind of the gender inversion and the way that your work operates as a taking possession of these men, and like kind of in the normal sense of like how gender works. But like, what if you made a piece that was about that but didn't have penises in it? And so she was like, yes, I would love to try to do that. So she made this 3-dimensional sculpture that is like basically a penis.
Made a penis.
Which I think is I don't know if you want to say anything to that, but I think that is like, I couldn't imagine a better way to end the conversation.